Hello and welcome to The Point. 2 weeks have passed since the presentation of the Union Budget 2014. The idea is to understand what are the issues ahead, in as much as what are the issues that have been addressed by this budget. To do this, I am now joined by Godrej Group Chairman Adi Godrej and also former CII President. Mr. Godrej, thank you very much for speaking with us.
Good talking to you.
So let's look at two sets of issues, right? So first, let's look at the growth and inflation issue, which was one of the key things going into this budget. And subsequently, we'll talk about some of the issues from an India Inc. point of view, including ease of doing business, right? So let's begin with growth and inflation, which were some of the key concern areas as we went into this budget, coming as we are on the heels of a slow growth environment.
Well, I think if you look at it over the last 2 to 3 years, there are several macroeconomic concerns which have developed. One was inflation was running very high. The rupee had depreciated considerably. And one of the reasons inflation continued for a long time and at high levels was the rupee depreciation, because it increases the cost of anything imported or increases the price in India of anything that is exported. The other problem was growth had slowed down. Now, it was expected that this government, now that for the first time we have a government with a majority in parliament in 30 years, and the government being growth oriented and investment oriented, would take steps to correct the situation. And many of these steps were enunciated in the budget. I think it was a good first budget for the new government. And I think if they take off from that position, I think a lot can be done to get India back on an 8% plus growth path.
Right. So let's go a little deeper into that. Now, how would you break that down, and where do you see the ingredients for that 8% kick as we are all hoping?
One of the major problems was investment had slowed down very considerably. New investments weren't taking place, partly because of, as you mentioned, ease of doing business had been negatively affected. So people weren't keen to invest. We had created a lot of tax issues with retrospective taxes, transfer pricing issues with international investors. So they had reduced a desire to invest. So many of these issues created a strong anti-investment stance, and that had led to growth deteriorating also. Now, I think one good announcement in the budget was that the investment allowance would be allowed even for investments up to 25 crore. But one of the things they have not yet addressed, and I do hope they address it before the budget is passed, is that many people who want to invest are unable to do so, because although some of the incentives are good, including this investment allowance, the MAT rate, minimum alternate tax, at around 22% is very high. So if you get incentives for X, Y and Z, but if your company is hit by the minimum alternate tax, you can't enjoy the incentive. So it is desirable at this stage to review the MAT and bring it down to maybe 15% or preferably even 12% or so. If they do that, I think they will find that investment will dramatically increase.
Okay, so that's a tax related incentive or lack of incentive. What about non-tax? What about the other sort of growth inhibitors or kickers that we need to be looking at?
Ease of doing business, it was never very good in India, but over the last 3 or 4 years it had deteriorated even further. So I think to improve the ease of doing business is a very important imperative. I think this government is clearly seized of that issue, including things like retrospective taxes and transfer pricing, etc. And they have already announced in the budget speech and in some of the budget provisions corrective steps. And I'm sure they'll announce more, because not everything needs to go through the budgetary route.
What about goods and service tax? That's something that you've been personally advocating for many years now. There was obviously a mention in the budget on it, but are you expecting a specific timeline and a
Yes, I think even in some of the media conferences, he has mentioned that he would like to put it in place by early next year, early 2015. I think he has understood that there are a couple of things that need to be done with the states to make them comfortable. And I think it's quite possible, and it's the biggest single step the government can take in getting us to a high growth path. because once the GST is introduced, unlike other reforms, it will kick in from the day it is introduced. From the day it is introduced, the GDP growth of the country will increase by about 2 percentage points, other things being equal.
Right.
So there is no single reform that can do even half as well.
Right. So let's look at it from the other side, from the consumption and demand side. How do you see that going, and did you see the budget doing sufficient or enough for that?
Some, I wouldn't say enough, but I think clearly some. I think some issues on excise duty were addressed. Some issues on inverted tax structure, where there is a higher import duty
On raw materials.
on raw materials than on intermediates or finished product. That was addressed in cases of many industries. And so I think, yes, many steps have been taken. More will need to be taken. And we know that the next budget is again due in a few months' time. It's not 12 months away.
Right. So again, from as industry, I mean, who obviously depends on consumption or higher consumption, what do you think would need to happen to really see that the kind of demand we perhaps saw a few years ago?
Well, clearly industrial production must accelerate, GDP growth must do well, inflation must come down, interest rates must come down. Fortunately, if you look at the macroeconomic indicators in the last month, many of them have improved. And I think with the steps they have announced and the very positive perception about the Indian economy in the future, I think a lot of this improvement will take place, and it will be a sort of a win-win situation. I expect that growth in this financial year will end up at somewhere between 5.5% and 6%.
Okay.
In
You
the next financial year, I expect it to be 7% plus.
Okay, and that's quite optimistic. So anyway, so you also talked about some of the indicators that have recently emerged, which are obviously looking good, and we're looking, I mean, manufacturing output being one of them. Can you illustrate your own example, and how have you been either stepping up output or?
No, clearly perceptions have improved. In some of our businesses, we already see better demand. For example, in appliances, we saw an excellent summer this year. I think the auto industry has also done well. We are not in the auto sector.
And you're saying appliances did well compared to last year?
Compared to the previous year. There was a growth of almost 30%, which is a very good growth. Partly because of the warm summer this year, and partly because of better perceptions. Some industry, for example, Fmcg has still not fully picked up, but I expect that in a month or two, it will start picking up. So I feel many industries are doing better. If you look at the results also that have been announced, many companies have announced better performance in the April-June quarter than in the same period of the previous year. And I expect this trend to continue.
Right. So when you say consumer products is something that is likely to pick up, you're therefore.
I'm talking of FMCG.
FMCG, fast moving. But that seems to be based on the premise that it's only sentiment that would bring it back, or is there something else that might?
No, it's mainly sentiment. Mainly sentiment. You see, why has FMCG slowed down? Because people were concerned about their jobs, about their incomes, and started consuming a little less per capita of FMCG product. Once people feel more confident of the economy, more confident of their jobs, I think increased consumption will return.
Right. So let me come back to investment. That's the other sort of, again, ingredient to the overall growth equation. How do you see it from your vantage point and the vantage point of your peers?
No, clearly we have changed our 3-year strategic plans. We feel now demand will increase, so we feel supply will need to increase. So we have changed our investment plans for our manufacturing units. We expect to invest more, we expect to produce more, and of course we have rolling 3-year plans. So we will watch the situation. Every 6 months we will review the situation. But I expect progress will be even better than most people are projecting.
So can you tell us specifically which areas you're likely to?
Well, all our consumer products, a large amount of our manufacture is in consumer products, whether it's durables or fast moving consumer goods. Our agri business is doing very well. It's already growing very well despite the general slowdown, and we think that will also accelerate. So overall we expect to invest more, we expect our sales will grow, and therefore our production needs to grow.
Right. So, when to what period would you compare this phase that you're seeing currently? When did you last see this? If one can draw some parallels.
See, let's put it this way. If you look at the positive perceptions and the positive expectations, I haven't seen such a situation except maybe 20 years ago when the 91 reforms were first announced and things were picking up and everybody was quite buoyant. I haven't seen that. As far as
even
actual
in the
performance,
2003-4 period, even?
yes, actual performance I would say still needs to come back to that 2004 to 2007 period when GDP growth was actually very high. That I expect it will take place, but that we have not fully seen yet.
Right. And lastly, we again, to come back, growth, inflation, investment. Inflation now, it's obviously something that affects you. I mean, every consumer of yours is, constrained if they're in a high inflation environment. Are you feeling more optimistic than the rest about where the inflation?
Yes, I expect inflation will start slowing. It already has slowed a little. But what worries us most about inflation is not how our consumer is affected by inflation, but the fact that when inflation is high, interest rates are high. If interest rates are high, investments become difficult. And consumer consumption, like say residential flats or autos, etc., slows down a lot because consumer financing becomes much more expensive. So it is extremely important for strong growth for both inflation to be contained and interest rates to be contained.
Right. So, and on the interest rate front, do you see?
I see positive because inflation is coming under control. The rupee is under control. I think a lot of the inflation we saw in the last 12 months was because of the rupee depreciation. Now, over the last 12 months, actually the rupee has appreciated a little to the dollar, and in the last 3 or 4 months it has appreciated very considerably. So I think the rupee is under control, our foreign exchange reserves are rising, so that I think will lead to lower interest rates. I expect interest rates will definitely come down within the next 3 to 4 months, but may even come down in a month or two, because clearly there are signs that inflationary expectations now are very low.
Right. So you're saying that overall it's looking like a fairly well poised situation.
Yes, I think overall it's looking well, it's well poised, it will allow the right actions on the part of the government is well informed, the government is well directed, and I expect this will take.
Right, so we'll take a break on that, Mr. Godrej, and I'll come back and talk about infrastructure, jobs and ease of doing business, India Inc. We'll be back on To The Point, stay with us. Welcome back to The Point. I'm still talking to Adi Godrej, Group Chairman of the Godrej Industries. Mr. Godrej, before we went into the break, we talked about growth, inflation, investment, and you talked about a fairly well-poised environment for growth and beyond. Let's talk about something more fundamental, infrastructure, and then I'll come to jobs and the ease of doing business. Infrastructure continues to be a big bugbear. It would affect you as much as it would affect every consumer of yours and every citizen in this country. Is enough being done, or was there sufficient signaling and financing for it in the budget, and what else needs to be done?
No, I think it's too early to expect that everything that needs to be done on infrastructure will be put in place, but clearly the signals given in the budget speech were very good. I think if you look at the infrastructure ministries, the one good thing is all the bifurcated and trifurcated ministries have been put together again. So there will be much more cohesion to my mind in how infrastructure is handled, whether it's roads, power, other transport, etc. I think a lot of good steps have been taken. Infrastructure is extremely important because it creates the investment, which itself creates the jobs and the employment. And also it will provide in a matter of a year or two the physical infrastructure which the country
How do
needs.
we not make the mistakes that were made in the past?
Because I think some of the past mistakes were because of concerns about Parliament, concerns about getting bills passed in Parliament, concerns about allies who keep threatening X, Y and Z all the way. Now they don't have to be too concerned about such issues. And I think they are clear-minded as to what India needs and what India will get. So I think it will operate much more efficiently.
Right. If you had a sort of infrastructure wish list, what would it be in terms, whether it's roads, ports?
I think everything. I think everything. Power, we fortunately have the capacity. It's the fuel issues. It was coal, gas. Many of them have to be sorted out. It's a matter of some administrative decisions. In coal, productivity needs to be increased. It's a shame that India, which has one of the highest reserves of coal in the world, is one of the world's largest importers of coal. Our gas issues have to be sorted out. We have lots of reserves of shale gas and even gas at the bottom of the seabed, and we need to increase our outputs in these areas. If you look at roads and other forms of transportation,
so you're placing energy a little higher than the rest of.
Energy is very high, and I would say transport is also very important. I think some of the decisions they have done on the railways, for example, to have fast bullet trains, to have much better goods transport in the railways, to make railway goods transport more competitive with road, etc., will, I think, add a lot of value in the long run.
And how do you see it benefiting, let's say, your group and the velocity at which, let's say, goods are able to move from place to place and the efficiencies?
Well, all logistics will improve. If GST comes, there will be a lot of other advantages, which when combined with infrastructure will add to rapid growth. And
what's the kind of profitability benefit that might accrue?
Well, I don't think there will be much profitability benefit. There could be some. But ease of doing business will definitely improve. You don't have to keep worrying about logistics. You don't have to keep worrying about effectivity in infrastructure. But what is also very important is not just physical infrastructure, but social infrastructure. So education and health, I feel this government will also pay a lot of attention to, which will solve a lot of issues. For example, currently there is a shortage of skilled and trained persons in the economy. So it will not only permit businesses to get the people they need, but it will create employment jobs, and once jobs and employment is created, consumption increases also. So it's a virtuous cycle you create.
Right. So let me link that to the budget. I mean, and I was going to come to jobs in any case. I mean, that was one of the factors on which this election was won, in a sense. I mean, the whole ability to meet the aspirations of young India. What are the kind of, I mean, where does the government or the policy makers need to move the fastest in order to ensure that some of these gaps are fixed?
Well, I think one of the most important things we need to do is to pay a lot of attention to skilling and training, because on one side we don't have adequate number of skilled persons. Even in skilled construction workers, there is a shortage in the country. On the other hand, people don't get employment. So sometimes I like to say there is no unemployment in India, just unemployability. If you provide skills, training and even education at a certain level, I think a lot of these problems on the employment front would get sorted out. But this government has also mentioned, and Rajasthan, which has a BJP government, has already done it, is to change some labor laws to make them more employment friendly. If you have labor laws which always gives a message to an employer, employ less people, it won't work. So that's one of the other areas of ease of doing business.
Right. So if I sort of stick to jobs for a second, you've talked about increasing your manufacturing capacity for which you need people. What's your sense? Would you depend only on the larger ecosystem to provide those people, or will private sector in general and specific play a greater role here?
No, I think the private sector will play a greater role, and not just the private sector, but small and medium enterprises will have to play a bigger role. It will be extremely important. If the economy picks up, if GST comes in, economic growth picks up, if we get to at least 7 to 8% next year and 8 to 10% in the year after that, we'll find there will be a lot of tightness in many areas. So we'll have to take advantage of all manufacturing units, especially medium and small enterprises, and India can boom again. We have seen some BJP governments in some of the states, not just Gujarat, but if you say Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh, etc., they have done well. Tomorrow I am meeting the Chief Minister of Madhya Pradesh in Mumbai, and that state has done very well in the last few years.
Right. So, what about having said that there is an obvious, I mean, there is a concerted attempt to fix the job problem. There is still a huge mass of young Indians who have aspirations. Are we? I mean, this is a much larger question. Are we as a country geared to meet these aspirations? In every possible way. First is to sort of educate them or make sure they're healthy. Then we educate them, and then of course we give them jobs.
Well, I think if you look at the vision of the country, I think we have the vision to do it. We've always found that where we have failed, or usually where we have failed, is implementation. So I hope this government pays a lot of attention on implementation. I have seen this government make statements that they want to pay a lot of attention to implementation. I think if they do that well, and if they empower states to implement things well, then I think things can move very rapidly.
Right. So let me ask you the more India Inc. question now. What are the issues that have been addressed to your satisfaction? What are the issues that have not been addressed?
No, I think ease of doing business is something you can't say it has all been addressed. It's always continuously improving. Keep the fewest possible permissions you need to get from the government. Secondly, implementation should be improved by combining ministries. If power and coal has been combined as they have, I think it will run very efficiently. If roads, shipping, etc. has been combined, it will run more efficiently.
And this you're saying from an India Inc. point of view, because you're interacting with government.
Yeah, we interact with government, and even for the government. If you have too many departments which have to coordinate with each other, and then there is a group of ministers that have to meet, and they find difficulty in finding time to meet, things are not going to move. And the environment ministry must get efficient. It's very important to pay attention to the environment. The environment is very important. Climate change has to be taken into account, but quick decisions should be taken, and technology should be utilized. And now I see the environment ministry now having moved quite rapidly on many fronts.
So, what about issues on the balance sheet and tax side? I mean, is that something that...
Yeah, those are also important. You see, the government has tremendous assets, whether it is shareholding in public sector companies, whether it is land, there are other assets, they should all be utilized. And if the economy does well as a result, the asset value after some assets are disposed of will increase. So the balance sheet size will increase. That will make the future so much better for the country. So I think there is tremendous opportunity, and the fiscal deficit must be contained. If necessary, in the first 1 or 2 years, more disinvestments can take place to ensure that there is fiscal deficit containment. Then of course inflation would be contained, and then interest rates would be contained.
Right. So, as we come to the end of the show, let me ask you in somewhat bullet point fashion, the 3 things that you feel that went right with the budget, and as you look back now, like 2 weeks later, and the 3 things or 2 or 3 things that clearly is part of the unfinished agenda.
Well, I think the 3 things that went well was the budget clearly addressed growth orientation. The budget addressed investment increases, and the budget address some of the issues that has kept industrial production down, as I said, inverted duty structure, etc. The 3 things that have to be done are, in all of these, there could be further refinements. As I mentioned, investment allowance limit being decreased to 25 crores was a very good move, but MAT will be a problem. That needs to be addressed. GDP growth can be even faster. If fiscal deficit is definitely contained, that can be done through disinvestment. The disinvestment target was increased, but he can do even better. And we must remember that a lot of economic policy is outside the scope of the budget. So there will be economic policies being announced till the February budget. I expect many more good policies to be further announced in February, when the government would have had a good 6-7 months to consider all the issues.
Right. And absolutely last question. So we've obviously had a uncertain monsoon, to put it mildly. Do you see that changing equations at all at the national level, as well as for companies like
it could, but the good news is that over the last week to 10 days, the monsoon has advanced well. The deficit in the monsoon has come down over the last couple of weeks. The prediction is the monsoon will continue well now. Earlier there was a worry that there would be an El Nino which might affect agricultural output in August and early September. Now clearly the expectation is the El Nino will be very weak. So hopefully the monsoon is not anywhere as bad as it looked towards the end of June or early July, and we have good agricultural output.
Right. So I'm not going to ask you to rate the budget on 0 to 10 or 1 to 10 as you would on budget day, but when you look back, has it left you with a good feeling?
Yes, very good feeling, and clearly even a better feeling on the positive steps this government will take going forward.
Right, Mr. Godrej, on that note, thank you so much for speaking with us.
Good talking to you. Thank you.
Well, that's all we have time for on this edition of To The Point. We'll be back next week, same time. Thanks for watching.